Hi everyone, Joanna Quilty, CEO of the New South Wales Council of Social Service here, and this morning I'm joined by Jason Yatsen-Lee, who is the Labor Party candidate for the seat of Strathfield in the upcoming by-election. Good morning, Jason, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Joanna. Great to be here and thank you for the opportunity.
So we've got a standard set of questions that we're going to go through and we'll just get underway if that's okay with you. The first one concerns housing costs, which we know in the Strathfield electorate are pretty high. There's a median house price of, I think, $3 million. Homelessness, even in an area like Strathfield, is on the rise. Homelessness services simply can't cope with the level of demand, and we know there's just not enough social housing. It's a pretty dire situation. So what is the ALP going to do in this regard?
So I agree, it's a dire situation, and at a macro level, I mean, on the surface, the electorate of Strathfield looks like a relatively affluent, wealthy electorate, but when you dig under the surface, particularly having gone through the last 2 years of the pandemic, there are a tremendous number of people who sleep rough, people in insecure work, people who live hand to mouth. It's actually a hidden pandemic. I was with Father James Collins at Parish Pantry the other day, looking at the wonderful work that they were doing, just supporting almost rarely seen members of the community who are in desperate need and are relying on charitable causes within the community supporting itself. So at a macro level, you're absolutely right. The relative affluence of the electorate is concealing the reality of a great number of social issues that are in the electorate. And I think it's our role to highlight those and to provide meaningful solutions to those. So to the housing issue, yes, absolutely. The price of housing in the electorate is very, very high, higher in some areas than others. It's also an enormously diverse electorate. We have places in Burwood where there are lots of international students who were completely left out in the cold when the borders were slammed shut and offered no government support whatsoever. Very insecure work and really struggled to feed themselves and to stay alive. And again, it was the community that came together to support them. Also, lots of workers in insecure work, living in rented accommodation, insecure accommodation, often through dodgy landlords who pack six to a room and really exploit people who aren't aware of their rights as tenants and what is proper. Some of the solutions, I would say, is a much greater investment in affordable and social housing. The federal Labor government is a great supporter of that, as is the New South Wales Labor government. And for me, it's a no-brainer. It creates employment. It supports the construction sector, but it answers a tremendously important social need that, as a basic human right, people need a decent roof over their heads where they're not at risk of being kicked out at a moment's notice should employment misfortune before them. So social housing, I think, is a key part of the ALP's policy, not just in respect of social justice, but in respect of economic development itself, because of the economic flow-on effects to the broader economy.
So you mentioned essential services at the front line supporting their communities during tough times. And I think during COVID, we have seen the social service sector really step it up to support the most vulnerable in our communities and keep them safe. But the sector itself is well and truly at capacity, stretched to the nth degree, and is struggling to actually recruit and retain staff, a lot to do with the low pay and the poor conditions that we can see in the sector. So what would you do to ensure that the social services sector gets the resources and the recognition that it needs?
Thanks, Joanna. Two main things. I mean, again, let me start at a macro level. We should have learned, all governments of all persuasions should have learned this key lesson from the pandemic, and that is neoliberalism, individualism, small government alone doesn't work. You need you need the community to be able to step up, and you need the government to be able to step up whenever there is an emergency. And COVID is not the last emergency we're going to confront. There's going to be a lot more, such as climate change, such as the changing nature of work. There will be more emergencies that confront our community, and small government, can-do capitalism, privatisation, rampant individualism, at best is kind of useless, and at worst is just dangerous, from what we saw happen in the United States. So I just make that as an overarching remark. What can we do about this? We need to invest more in the social infrastructure of our communities. We need to invest more in the ability of the community to be resilient, so that when the disaster strikes, it is able to come and support those in need. So there's two things I think here. One is much greater state support and state-supported investment in respect of good community organisations who have the business models, the resources, the experience to be able to provide that support within the community. The other thing is, I think I'm a big believer in communities at a grassroots level drawing on their own resources and being able to support those within it. So I think another interesting area where that should be explored is, how do we empower communities to be able to identify and harness the resources? So within any suburb, or in any sort of, where I'm at now outside Strathfield Prepole, within this area, within a 2-kilometre radius, there is so much talent here. There would be people who are experienced at healthcare, at emergency services, at management. There's lawyers, there's professionals, there's essential workers. This community has a wealth of resource and experience. So when somebody who lives within this community is in trouble, how does the community embrace them and provide them with the support, whether it is a roof over their heads, whether it is the advice that they need in terms of how to access emergency support or get their businesses back on track? How do we empower a local community to have the resilience to support those within it with need?
I'm going to come to the issue of emergency responses and community input into that in a minute, but we know that women have been particularly hard hit by COVID, whether because of increased caring responsibilities, greater job loss, or the rise in domestic violence that we've seen as a result of the pandemic. So what will you do, and what will the ALP do to better support women and children in an electorate like yours, and to tackle the problem of domestic violence?
Thank you. That is an extremely important question, and one that's really close to my heart. So Sam Mostyn was my former boss, and I used to work with Sam a while ago, and she's just such an amazing person, and I'm so pleased that she is at the forefront of leading the policy and the implementation support around
economic review. Absolutely,
some of this work. But your point is absolutely correct. When I talk about the work, the social infrastructure that has been what has got us through the pandemic, the care infrastructure, more than often powered by women, and more than often unpaid work. And so I think that further work to understand the contribution that women make, the contribution that is often unpaid and often unrecognised, and to make sure that there is much greater investment in that care infrastructure. So it is in aged care, it is in disability care, it is in health care, it is in all these sectors that, they don't get the recognition. And if there's any silver lining, and it's hard to think, if there's any silver lining from the pandemic, it is to highlight how, but for these sectors and the ability of these sectors to rise up in a really Australian spirit, I think that's something that defines us as a country. We do rally as a community when people are in need, and we become united, and we rally well in spite of government sometimes. I think that's one of the lessons of the pandemic. So how do we invest more and really bring to the fore the contribution of women in these areas, but then double down on that, provide greater resources, investment, and profile, so that becomes one of the pillars of resilience within the community.
So, somewhat surprisingly, there's quite high rates of child poverty in the Strathfield electorate, with areas like Strathfield South, Homebush, and Burwood having rates of children living in poverty. At least, 1 in 5 kids
Yep.
are in poverty in those areas, which is a pretty startling statistic. And we know that it does place those children at greater risk of abuse, neglect,
Yep.
and poorer educational outcomes. And it's really tough for families trying to raise kids in an impoverished environment. So, what are your policies when it comes to supporting parents and children's wellbeing?
It actually doesn't surprise me, Joanna, when you look at the nature of insecure work. There's lots of migrant communities here who live hand in hand. They come to Australia with literally nothing. And they rely on their skills and their hard work to feed their families, literally living hand to mouth. They're in rented accommodation, often of poor quality. They often don't know their rights as tenants. And it doesn't surprise me at all, particularly during the pandemic and when somebody loses their job. It results immediately in poverty for the kids. I used to be a governing member of the Smith family during Elaine Henry's day, and that is a cause that is still close to my heart. That was the time when the Smith family pivoted from emergency services to early intervention in early childhood education amongst disadvantaged families. That's something I still care passionately about, because it was the story around why that happened. When talking to the families, the disadvantaged families and where at the time they were being provided with emergency blankets and hampers and food support. And we asked, what else can we do for you? And overridingly, the parents said, if you can do this for us, make sure our kids have more opportunities in life than we have. Make sure that they don't end up like we are. And that to me is about educational opportunity, making sure that just because you're poor or your family is in financial trouble, you are not disadvantaged in your education, that you can afford to reach your potential, to have all the support around you, like every other kid, to do well at school. That's still really. I'm really passionate about that.
Yeah, I mean, they're a fantastic organisation, and absolutely education is the key. You touched before on emergency responses, and we know that the research tells us that top-down emergency responses can suffer from that lack of local knowledge, from that community input. It's either too much too soon or too little too late. So what do you think are the key issues in developing disaster preparedness and emergency response systems that actually work on the ground?
So it's a matter of joining up the top down and the bottom up. Right? So at a government level, from the top down, there needs to be the policy framework and the financial support and the resources that are available. The bottom up part is, where are the organisations that are genuinely embedded in the community, that understand the local community, who can deliver these services at a very local level. The two need to be joined in an effective way. So, as I said, we've been to see Father James Collins at Parish Pantry. We're at the St Mercurius. They do a wonderful job. They provide over 4,000 meals a month to needy families, nutritious meals. There is so much good work that is being done in the community by lots of different organisations. The question is, how do we join up the work of these organisations to understand where we can amplify and scale what is working, how do we identify where are there gaps? Are there, whether in geographic areas or in areas of concern, how do we make sure that those gaps are plugged? And then when the top down comes in, how do we make sure there is the financial support and the policy frameworks to support the growth and the development of this sector?
I'm getting messages that my internet is unstable. So we have only got one last question, and I better hurry along here. We are seeing more and more disasters, be it the current pandemic or bushfires, floods, droughts. And we know that all of these have the greatest impact on already disadvantaged groups and certainly on people's health, particularly their mental health. So when it comes to healthcare, what needs to happen to ensure that our local health systems are robust enough to cope with these occurrences and the impact on people's health?
Well, hopefully, the pandemic has shown us that we need to invest a lot more in our health infrastructure, in hospitals, doctors, nurses, essential healthcare workers. That is a no-brainer. That hopefully that is clear, and government can do that. But I think that there is more than just I guess, the response when somebody is already sick, and the care is there. But I think that there's a lot more that we can do on the prevention side of things. So one of the things that I'm committed to, if I'm successful, is to put in place a comprehensive wellness strategy for the electorate that encompasses physical activity. So getting out, older people, younger people, getting out, expanding our green open spaces and exercising and becoming physically active. It should encompass nutrition, how to eat healthily, healthy foods, balanced diets, less junk food, less sugar. But it also needs to encompass mental health as well. There is so much of a burden of mental health across the electorate because of the pandemic, but because of just the pressures of everyday life. So if I'm successful, that's one of the first and most important things that I'd really like to commit to: a healthier, happier electorate.
Look, Jason, that brings us to the end of the interview. That's all the questions that we have for you today, but we do want to wish you well and say all the best on Saturday and in the few days leading up to that. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Joanna. If I'm successful, I really look forward to working with you guys.